Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming along to the FCC. Great to see a full room again, which shows that there is considerable interest in Formula One in Hong Kong. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, and it's a great pleasure to welcome back Matthew Marsh once again to the FCC. So I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. Please make sure all your mobiles are all switched off. As I say, it's great to have Matthew back. Jet fresh from Suzuka. And so what was that all about? I mean, business as usual, really. We all got a bit excited after Singapore. 4 cars covered by 2 seconds. A week later, that man Verstappen, he's back on probably the most dominant win he's had all season, I would have thought. So that car just seems to keep getting better. I mean, nobody seems to be catching up.
I think it does.
No.
Before I say anything libelous.
You're on.
I'm obviously on because you laughed at that. Okay, that's good. And you might have heard these anecdotes, but Max apparently was playing paddle tennis with Christian Horner, his team principal, and said, I'm going to beat everybody by 20 seconds this weekend. And it was only 19.3 or something. Oh, yeah. Something 19.7, you're probably right, Tim. Tim's normally good on the facts. And, but he did mention to Christian that, yeah, but I got held up on the last lap or something like that. But the other thing that was interesting was that free practice 1, his first lap he did was a second and a half faster than anybody else had gone so far, and he was on the hard tyre.
So they were all mentally knocked out of the ballpark from
and I
first lap.
don't think, like, to your point, I mean, Singapore was an incredible race, and we're going to talk, I think, today about how actually there's lots of reasons to be excited about Formula One 2023 style, but it was only we knew it was a kind of a blip in the Max Verstappen charge to the drivers, to an early drivers' championship. So it wasn't really a surprise. And I'm one of those people who, I think it's mega. I love it. I love watching a guy just, like when Michael Schumacher dominated. You know, I love a guy who goes out and just goes, that's how you do it.
Yeah, but for your armchair fan, your casual fan, I mean, there's such a level of domination. Is it good? I mean, people go into each weekend. I mean, I got asked by our mate Phil Whelan on the radio last week, well, it's the same thing I do every race. And he says, well, so who's going to win? And you always say, well, Max Verstappen, isn't it? Yeah. So if everybody's going in and they're certain of the result of the winner, and as Damon Hill used to say, the only people who you remember you're coming second are your wife and your dog, surely that's not so good for the sport and its growth.
Well, so I've prepared some questions in advance of this, which I'm going to ask you, the audience, in a second. But before, the reason I did that was that a friend who should know better, who is an F1 avid fan, I texted him before the Singapore Grand Prix, and I said, well, I see you. And he said, no, I'm flying back in from business, and it's so predictable this year, and blah, blah, blah. And just basically, Mr. Angry from Radio 2 in the, Mr. Angry from Richmond or wherever it was. And obviously on Sunday night at Singapore, I just texted him and said, any updates? I'm still waiting to hear. So I want to do a quick show of hands on some questions about, first of all, who considers themselves to be a Formula One fan? So obviously we are. I want to you don't have to be, by the way, this is not a reason to be. I'd like to know who is and who is not, okay? So just quick Formula One fan? It's about 90%, okay. So, and again, this is not to judge anybody, it's just purely because I'm going to ask you some questions and I want to see how it fits to the different types of F1 fan. Who would watch more than half of the F1 races live on television? Okay?
Yep.
Good. Good or bad, doesn't matter. Who has been to a Formula One race? Okay, great. I was going to ask which is the earliest year you've been, but I need to compare it to Tim Huxley, who was it 1977?
Yes.
Because last time we were here, he mentioned the 1972 Monaco Grand Prix, but actually he wasn't at the 1972 Monaco Grand Prix, which is making my point. He watched it on television or read about it, whatever. Who still wakes up in the morning? And I should have said, first of all, to make this joke actually funny, the reason I brought alcohol with me is that anybody who mentions Abu Dhabi 2021, there's a bar fine situation, okay? So my next question is, who wakes up in the morning still not believing what happened at Abu Dhabi in 2021? Okay, please raise your glasses. Thank you very much. And who thinks that Formula One at the moment, this is the last question, is boring? Good, thank you.
Right, well, that's a smattering of people who think that. Now then, you're trying to grow a business. I mean, you've got Liberty Media wanting to expand it, and it has expanded massively in places like the States. But are they having anxious moments worrying about the way it is? I mean, your mate Stefano, do they say, come on, guys, you've got to pull your finger out?
So I think there's two sides to this. I'll go with what I feel about it, and I think what most of us in the room feel, because only a few hands went up to say they think it's boring. So I think that, yes, it's predictable that Max Verstappen will probably win each Grand Prix and will win the World Championship. That's predictable. But I did a bit of looking at the results. I think we've had from 16 races, 6 different second-place finishers and 9 different third-place finishers. And we've got Lewis Hamilton within striking distance of Sergio Perez for second in the Drivers' Championship. Unlikely, but we've got this incredible battle for next best, not only driver, but of team. We've got these young guys, lots of young guys, actually, coming up. And so there's so many things. Does Stefano think about it? I think every day. My experience of him is he's a racer, absolutely. And so he will probably admire what Red Bull Racing and Verstappen are doing, but he's running a business and he's thinking, how do we constantly grow the business from this amazing base? So I'm sure he'd prefer it to be 2021, but apart from the Abu Dhabi part.
Yeah. Now, last year we had these new regulations introduced, the idea being it was going to bunch everybody up, it was going to be closer racing, easier overtaking, and what have you got? Somebody disappears off into the distance at the start. Admittedly, good scraps behind. I mean, so everybody was working to these incredibly tight regulations, and everybody's got a budget cap. So how is it that one team can eke out such a massive advantage? Is Adrian Newey the sort of stardust that everybody is looking for? I mean, he's been designing championship-winning cars for 30 years.
Yeah.
I mean, what is it about it? Why did they have that huge advantage?
He's not paid enough, is he, Adrian Newey?
No, he should be paid more than Max Verstappen.
Exactly. He's the worst paid person in Formula One, you could argue, right? I mean, it's incredible. So just rewinding on your question, which was a good question, because Singapore Grand Prix, top 3 qualifiers covered by 72 thousandths of a second, I think it was, and the finishers were covered by 1.5 or 1.7. I mean, incredibly close. Okay, because it proves that point we're making. If you take Verstappen out of the equation, and it is, by the way, only Verstappen, another topic we'll come to later.
Another one, yeah.
It is incredibly close. What's the difference? I think it is the design team at Red Bull. It is the fact that we went from these cars where the downforce, it's an aerodynamic sport, where all the downforce was driven from the top of the car, and now it's driven by the bottom of the car. And whilst you get more downforce, it's more difficult to achieve in a way that is usable. So let's say the usable area is much tighter with a ground effect car. They have to run them low. The lower you can run to the ground, the more effective the car is. But then it can lose that downforce, and that's what's been happening. The Red Bull, because of the way the suspension works, is better at that than the other cars. You've seen McLaren shift it. They went to Bahrain. They were a second plus off the pace. They said, just forget it. We need to start again. They realized. We've seen Aston Martin do it earlier. The Red Bull philosophy works, but it's different. How did they get there ahead of the others? That's kind of the question. I think Adrian Newey is a key part of that. But actually, if you rewind the clock, those years of Mercedes dominance, Red Bull still won whatever it was, 2 or 3 races a year, right? With a suboptimal power unit. Now they've got an at least equal power unit. They're dominating again, as they were in the Sebastian Vettel years. So you could say, and I'm saying it now, but I think they've been that good for
20 years.
No, 10 years, isn't it?
Well, if you
13,
go back a bit,
13 a bit.
If you wind it back, the incarnation of Red Bull from Stewart into Jaguar, I mean, that just shows how you can get it wrong, doesn't it?
Well, in the early days, you remember the wheels used to fall off quite often, because Adrian's also quite famous for going, slim and lightweight, and there's been some times it's been really good, and some times when the wheels fall off. I mean, actually, literally. And but I think he's got a team of people around him now that maybe say, I'm not sure about that part, but this part works well. And the aero is obviously where he's a genius.
So who's really impressed you this year? Who are the winners and the losers? I mean, Verstappen, obviously, but elsewhere, as you say, really good young guys coming through. and threatening some of the people who thought they were established stars.
Well, that's it. So we've obviously got Verstappen, and we've got, I mean, obviously Lewis, Verstappen, Leclerc, all these guys. But the anecdotes, I think, are always the most fun in these conversations. Sharing with you privately, streamed live on Facebook around the world, or whatever it is, some comments. I was in the paddock on Singapore. I took my daughter there on Thursday, and she's a 13-year-old girl, as daughters often are. And it was good to see F1 through her lens. And she had met Lando Norris at the Macau Grand Prix in 2017. There's a whole other topic about the Macau Grand Prix. It's where you used to see the stars before they became stars. Anyway, then 2018, he was in Formula 2, and she got to meet him a couple of times, again in the paddock at Silverstone, and then we went to the Goodwood Festival. And so she knew him before he was a star. And this is kind of an important thing, because I took her into the paddock, and she was nervous, and what am I going to do? And I said two things. Just say hello. I can't say hello. Okay, I'll do the say hello part. But then don't do a selfie, because I've watched the drivers, and you see people, because a selfie actually takes quite a long time, and it is an invasion of personal space. I mean, this is the reality, and I've seen how the drivers react. So we went up, and I said, hey. He said, oh, hi. And I said, I just did Megan. He said, hey. Actually, no, he didn't do hey. He did, hey, you've changed, because she's now... And she said back, so have you. And that started the conversation, right? So that was really good fun. And by the way, what a terrific guy Lando is. Because I've observed, this point about the selfies, I've observed him having to do selfies. I saw it at Silverstone. He walked into the McLaren motorhome, and this is 2 hours after he's flat in top gear through Copse Corner, which takes some, whatever the right word is these days, And that's aggression, let's call it aggression. And then he walks in the motorhome, and a guy comes over, and he's in the motorhome, so he doesn't know who the person is. It could well be a McLaren partner. But anyway, Lando's professional and a nice person. And the guy does that with the camera, and then, of course, the camera doesn't work. And he's now got this guy in his face for about 30 seconds. And I can see the sort of slight irritation, but he's managing it. So it's my way of saying, don't do the selfies, because it's... Why am I telling you that? Oh, because the point is that they're doing this aggressive stuff. So I'm then in the paddock at Singapore, and I'm talking to Joe Saywood, who, if you don't know Joe Saywood, one of the great Formula One journalists. He's been covering the sport since he's been to every single Grand Prix since 1988. Most of the races these days he drives to and from in his Tesla. He lives in France. He's a terrific guy.
Son of a vicar.
Huh?
Son of a vicar.
Son of a vicar. Who else might be a son of a vicar in this room? And he was with us when we did this thing with Lando Norris, and he said to my daughter, you're a fan of Lando, yeah. I've got bad news for you. The guy who's behind him, his teammate, Oscar Piastri, is the best I've ever seen, which through the lens of 1988 to today is really saying something. And then we saw it at Suzuka. This is 16 races into his career, and he out-qualifies Lando. And, okay, he finished behind him in the race, and that's the thing he has to learn is managing the tyres. But I think Piastri's really... I think Lando's as good as... certainly as good as Russell, maybe as good as Max. We'll see. There's no reason to say he isn't. You can't point at mistakes. You can't point at pace and say Lando's not as good as Max yet. So what's Piastri then? 16 races in,
First visit to Suzuka as well.
Yeah.
I mean, pretty impressive.
Very.
And so let's go to the sort of far end. I mean, who's been the big disappointment this year? I mean, Sergio Perez, he was talking a big game at the beginning of the year, saying, I'm going to be champion.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the problem, isn't it? So I like it when I'm proven right about something. And I went to Melbourne, and Sergio, so the first race Verstappen won, second race Sergio won, right? And I think Melbourne was the third race, I think I've got that right. And we went to Melbourne, and in free practice, he made a mistake where he locked up in free practice and just went off into the gravel and hit the wall, from memory. Mike Bishop in the room, you'd remember which practice session it was, right? FP1, 2? One of those, okay. But it's one of those mistakes where, really? And I thought, there's a guy who's not feeling the road surface through the brake pedal in the way that the great drivers do. He's trying too hard. And I thought, yes, because he thinks he can be world champion, because I think he was leading the championship at that point. He'd certainly equal wins with Max. He's always surrounded by people that are telling him he's amazing, and he thinks, yeah, this is our chance, that kind of thing. And it was because Max goes off the racetrack, but he doesn't do silly mistakes. He makes a mistake when it's necessary. And then we've seen Sergio do these other mistakes, qualifying one at Monaco when you have no risk, smashing the car to pieces against the wall. Not a good idea, basically. So I think that's a disappointment because I think somebody should have said to him, in the same way that if you're going to be a world champion, like a Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Sebastian Vettel, the model is Michael Schumacher. What did Michael do? How did Michael conduct himself? Just write it down. It's pretty simple and follow it. Arrive first, leave late, leave last, be the fittest, understand the engineers the best. I mean, when Pirelli came into Formula One, this is a long answer. Tim knows that. I can't remember the question, that's why. When Pirelli came into Formula One to replace Bridgestone as the tyre supplier, there were only two people that that contacted Pirelli beforehand. Only two. One was Michael Schumacher, one was Sebastian Vettel. Vettel because he just copies Michael Schumacher. Correctly, right? That's what you do. You copy the best, right? And Michael actually went to Italy and met the guys because they're providing the tyres for everybody. And so if I can influence them slightly, guess what? They're using my tyres. So that's the sort of thing you should do. Why am I telling you about this?
We're on Perez.
Oh, yeah, Perez.
Why?
Somebody should have said to Sergio Perez, your model is Eddie Irvine. Because Eddie Irvine joined Ferrari as teammate to Michael Schumacher and understood very quickly, you're not going to beat him to the World Championship, but you can make an awful lot of money, and by the way, win some Grand Prix, and drive for Ferrari, and live in Milan, and things that are peripheral to that. I wasn't going to say it, Tim, because this is a family show, but all of those things that go with it. And Eddie's having a great life now living in Florida and investing in property and remembering those days. And Sergio seems to be looking sad every time I see him, which that doesn't square with his position.
Well, that's it. I mean, they are the chosen ones, aren't they? It's the 20 people who are doing something that loads of other people really want to kill for, and yet a lot of them don't look happy. And the one who never really seems to look happy, who really seems out of place, is Lance Stroll, who, there's nothing. My dad had bought me a Formula One team. I mean, I'd be pretty happy. But Fernando Alonso scored 80% of Aston Martin's points. Old Lance, he's not having a lot of fun and probably costing his dad a lot of money if McLaren jumped them in the constructors, because that's where the prize money's decided.
Yeah. I'm trying to think so I'm going to tell you a funny anecdote. So I was at the Singapore Grand Prix, as I've mentioned a few times, and who was at the Singapore Grand Prix? Obviously I was, I'm just okay. It's a great event, I really recommend it. It's a super event. It's a super event and it's a great Grand Prix. And the thing I love about the 23 or 24 race schedule next year is there's all these different kinds of events you can go to that have different things they offer. Monza you go to and it's this historic place. You get there, you realize, wow, Suzuka's the same in that way. And then you're in Singapore, which is this sort of carnival, music, entertainment event with all these business things going on. Anyway, I was in the paddock and somebody said to me, oh, this is the famous Japanese chef Nobu. And he was actually wearing a chef's jacket with the word Nobu on it. So that bit I knew.
Pretty obvious.
Could you go and introduce him to Lance Stroll? To which the answer would normally be, no. What do you mean? How can I do that? It's between free practice 3 and qualifying. Why would anybody try to do that? But the person asking me was the race promoter, so I try my best. So I walk with him and I say, oh, do you know Lance Stroll? He says, yeah, I know the Strolls quite well. They come into my restaurant a lot. So I'm now thinking, how am I going to get Lance Stroll to come out and say hi to this chef when he's... So I went into the Aston Martin thing and I said, I'm sorry, is Lance here? Because the famous Japanese chef Nobu is here and he'd like to say hello. And they went upstairs. And then indeed Lance came down. And as he came towards me, I said, oh, I think you know Nobu the chef. And he said, yes, and walked straight past me, straight past Nobu and into the garage. And as I came out, I just went, so I think he's busy. But it's my point of saying, Lando wouldn't have done that, for example. And no, I don't think any of them would, actually. First of all, most of them probably wouldn't have been coming down, to be fair, anyway. But I don't think he's in a particularly happy place. And maybe it's because he feels the pressure. And he feels the pressure of everybody saying, why is he driving that car? He's a very decent racing driver, but the problem is when you're in a car that now seems capable of podium finishes, as proven by his teammate, it's got to feel bad when you're not doing that and people have a kind of a reason attached to you. Logan Sargent's doing a pretty poor job compared to Alex Albon, right? But yeah, no one's talking about it because it's his first season and Alex is great and Logan's was promoted too early and all of these other reasons. But with Lance, there's no real reasons anymore. And
well, the pressure of having your dad as your boss.
There's that as well. It's all bad. And by the way, it's a bit of a Hong Kong thing. I often talk about, difficult fathers who run big companies and who have, yeah.
And then you mentioned there, Sergeant, but also this new arrival, Liam Lawson. I mean, that's a pretty good start. I mean, thanks to Daniel Ricciardo breaking his hand. I mean, I bet Liam Lawson costs a lot less than Daniel Ricciardo. Why shouldn't he just be pensioned off?
Well, there's lots of positives here. The first is, as I said earlier, we've got all these young 21, 22, 23, young drivers who are just terrific. And so the sport is very healthy in that regard. I do think, just going off on a slight tangent, I still think we have a problem that Formula One testing is so restricted. There are so few days now, and it's kind of fewer and fewer every year, for cost-cutting reasons. And I understand that, of course. But it does mean that the young drivers never really get a chance, I think, to hone their skills. These cars are super complicated, And I spent some time at the weekend with Ryo Hirakawa, he's a Le Mans winning driver with Toyota at Le Mans. He's now a reserve driver for McLaren. And I said, you've just driven the simulator. He said, the Toyota is much more complicated, but an F1 car is super hard to drive. And one of the things about it is the tyre degradation. That's why Oscar Piastri basically had a pretty poor race compared to Lando. He said, tyre degradation you only learn by driving, right? So that concerns me, because we have a situation now where Liam Lawson comes in halfway through the Netherlands Grand Prix weekend and does a great job, and then does a brilliant job at Monza, gets in the points at Singapore. Just outside the points at Suzuka. Yeah. And he's not going to be he's not going to be starting the season next year, right? And if he'd actually been testing, if he'd done 5,000 kilometers of testing, he would probably have done enough where they thought, wow, this guy's really good. And we saw that a lot in the past when testing was open. So I don't have the answer to this. I know the question. The question is, how do we avoid this situation where great drivers come in? Mick Schumacher is a good example. Mick maybe with more testing could have done a better job. Lance maybe with more testing, maybe not now, but then. The Brazilian driver, Felipe Drugovich, who won the F2 championship last year, sits in Aston Martin team gear in the motorhome. What? It's ridiculous. He's so good. Because he hasn't done thousands of kilometers of testing to prove that to people. The drivers at Haas, I know I've gone away from the question, ladies and gentlemen, but we'll come back to it. The drivers at Haas are great, aren't they? Nico Hülkenberg and Kevin Magnussen, both in their 60s, approaching, they're great. But the reason that they're there is that they do a pretty good job and they don't smash the car to pieces, which in the overall business situation is good. But if Drugovich, for example, or Lawson or anybody else had done these kilometers of testing, they would be gone because he'd be 0.4, half a second, a lap faster. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk.
Thank you. That's right. But so leading on from that, right, we've got these 20 very good drivers, but there's scope. Obviously, there's plenty of others banging on the door. But the teams don't want to admit any more new teams. I mean, in the good old days, you had 36 pretty, and 18 of them were pretty crappy, cars trying to qualify. Is restricting it just to the 10 teams, is that a good idea? Or should we admit 2 or 3 more teams? They want to come in.
No, I think we have to look at the overall situation. At the moment, Formula One is very, very healthy. And it's very, very healthy because when Liberty Media took over the business, Chase Carey, who knows who Chase Carey is? Quick show of hands. Yeah. Be great. So Chase Carey is the reason why Formula One is great today, I believe, because here's a guy who came in who, by his own admission, thought F1, this is my words, not his, was a key on your keyboard probably, but he looked at it properly, and this actually looking from the outside is normally a really good thing. And we're seeing actually more and more F1 teams hire people from outside F1 because it gives a different perspective, which we all employ in our businesses, right? Why wouldn't we in F1? So Chase came in, looked at it and said, and that's why Liberty Media, I presume, bought it, because they looked at it and said, this is undervalued. If we change a few things around and we work hard, we can make it worth what it is now, 2 or 3 times the share price, something like that, right? So they did a great job. One of the things that they did was restricting or changing the imbalance of performance, right? So saying, look, guys, and I think Chase was in a position where he could sit to the table and say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to equalize the share of the pie. Okay, hold on, Ferrari, hold on the other guys who get an unequal share, because the pie is going to get bigger. If we make the the slice is more equal or more fair is better, the pie will get bigger. You'll all get more. Everybody will be healthier, and the business is healthier. And in the past, F1 teams used to come in and then they would die. That's not good for anybody, really. Sort of oxygenates maybe the business, but I don't think it's good overall. We've got 10 teams. How many do we need? This is the Champions League of motorsport. There's no crap teams in Formula One. There's no crap drivers. There used to be both crap teams, because they would tie, and there used to be crap drivers. There are no more, right? I mean, you know, we talk about Stroll, we talk about Logan. They're just not as good as the other 18, basically. But they're not crap by any means, right? So why would Formula One want an 11th or a 12th team? I don't see any upside at all. And I see lots of downsides. One is you've now got more teams competing with sponsorship. How do you fit all these teams into the garages? I mean, there's just, you know, a very important point of Formula One's business going forward is sustainability. There's a lot of work going on. We hear about some of it. We don't hear about most of it. Who knows that Formula One cars are hybrid power units? Okay, now, so that's about 50% of the room. I think if I went into a grandstand at a Grand Prix, I mean, you've all chosen to come and pay money to listen to me talk. Okay, sorry about that. But if we went to a Grand Prix, I bet less than 10% of the people in the grandstand, depending on which Grand Prix, would actually know the cars are hybrid. So there's work to be done on that, because I think it's really important. F1 is part of the solution. But my point is, an 11th team adds 10% to the carbon footprint, I think, because it's more people. Because the carbon footprint, by the way, and you'll all know this, is obvious. It isn't the cars going around the racetrack. The hydrocarbons burnt in the race car is less than 1%. It's mostly travel and logistics, which every sport does. So why would F1 want to add 10% to that? I don't see any upside. Now, I can understand why the FIA, that was my pause for thought on getting accreditation in future, why the FIA might want to suggest that they can be an 11th and a 12th team and court people and have conversations and make friends and influence people. But for the business, I don't see any upside.
And looking at that, you talked there about Liberty Media and everything. And, you know, we're sort of several years in from the post-Bernie Ecclestone era. Is there anything from that era that people miss or regret, or is it, you know, the sunlit uplands have finally been arrived at?
Well, I miss something. I'm very good at making mistakes. I'm getting better at observing them, but in retrospect, you see what I mean? So when I used to work for Zach Brown, who now runs McLaren, I worked for him for 7 or 8 years. And when he came into F1, friends of mine said, "Oh, your man, Zach. Really? Running a Formula One team? Doesn't know what he's doing, all of these." Not rude, but just like, does he know what he's doing? Look at him, etc. I said, "Trust me. I've observed him by working directly for him for 7 years. He's a very, very good operator. He works extremely hard. He's smart. He thinks strategically. He surrounds himself with great people. There's no doubt in my mind that he will make a success of that, right? And indeed, as has been proven, right? And when the Liberty guys took over Formula One, what I didn't think was they're very similar to Zach, and I should buy the shares. Because I kind of fell into the, I wonder if they're going to know what they're doing with this, which was just wrong, because it was kind of obvious. There you go. Sorry.
So
that's not financial advice, by the way.
So that was all positive since then. But one thing that we do seem to have maybe slightly lost our way on is where Formula One stands in this part of the world. I mean, we've just had Singapore, Japan, both hugely successful, always sellouts. But over the years, I mean, we've lost India, South Korea, Malaysia, Vietnam didn't happen, China, okay, fine, that's due to come back next year after the COVID thing, but the media don't particularly, that's not their favourite race by any stretch. So has Formula One, under Liberty, have they decided, right, let's take that American market, and we've got Miami, Austin, we've got Las Vegas next month, well, in November. Is Asia being neglected?
No, I don't think so. From speaking to Stefano about this recently, Stefano Dominicali, who's the CEO of F1, in case you didn't get the name drop, he clearly, as I said earlier, he's focused on every part of the business. He wants to grow it. So when I had a conversation with him in Singapore, we want to do more. He pointed specifically to Japan as being a very important market and one which the race sells out. Equally, unlike the rest of the world now, where due to the various initiatives, the gender balance, and the gender balance is much more equal. It used to be 70%, 30% roughly, maybe 70-something, and then it was a relatively older demographic. They haven't shifted it younger. That by adding a new population of fans, the overall has shifted younger and more balanced. And in Japan, that hasn't happened yet, because I think a lot of the initiatives were English language initiatives. The Drive to Survive series, which is amazing and has really opened the door to people. That doesn't, as I understand it, doesn't translate particularly well. The same is true in China. They've got a Chinese driver now, but Drive to Survive, I'm told the subtitles, this doesn't work, right? So I think, how do we do that? I think the problem that we all know in this room, because we live in Asia, is that Asia is a concept. And, what would you do about Asia? Well, the first thing you do is you wouldn't call it Asia. You'd say, like they did with the US, let's do that market rather than those markets. And what does that mean? Again, I mentioned earlier, I think I know some of the questions, but the answers are very complicated. For example, India, if we could get a tiny percentage of people in India to start watching Formula One, it would add quite a big percentage to the overall F1 500 million plus unique fans, stroke viewers. So to me, okay. But how would you do it? And I spoke to an Indian friend of mine who's been in the sport for a long time, a TV producer from Fox, and I said, presumably we'd want to do local language, Hindi. She said, this is just first blush. This is over a cup of coffee. She said, no, probably in the South region, probably speaking Tamil. And I thought, again, I know the question, I don't know the answer, if you know what I mean. And that, to me, I think there are some relatively low-hanging fruits there, but it's really tough. The second part on this one is it is a two-way street. The reason that Singapore has been successful is that Singapore saw the value in being on the F1 calendar and delivers in a partnership with Formula One, in my perspective. Perfect example of this, right? As somebody who's worked in the media as well as on the commercial side, there are certain Grand Prix you arrive at and you feel welcome, and there are certain you do not. I had a thing when I was going to go to Russia, and I went to the embassy and they were blah, blah, blah. I said, you have to understand, I don't want to go. So this is not a problem to me. But you invited me to come to your Grand Prix. Literally, there's a letter, and separately, you spent $something million on the right. So I assume you want us to go and televise it. So please, can you like that? Which did actually slightly help the situation. I think the Russians quite like frank speaking. Then you go to Singapore is the complete opposite. Right, let's make sure everybody arrives easily when they get to the media center. It's properly air conditioned. There's more than enough space, incredible internet connectivity. They've got great food, and it's food people recognize. There's Haagen-Dazs ice cream, TWG tea, Nespresso, the subtle things that make everybody go home saying, I love Singapore. Just why, if you're going to spend $30 million for sake of argument, if you're going to spend $30 million per year on hosting a Grand Prix, which, by the way, I think is a massive, is a bargain.
That's a cheap deal.
It's a bargain, right? We know individuals that could afford to do that, right? So countries, come on, seriously, 30 minutes, nothing. Then why don't you spend another 2 or 3 on top to make this activating the sponsorship, right? But there are other countries, and I have to say, unfortunately, I love China, I love Shanghai, but I go there and it's the opposite. The food's a bit, what is that? And the journey to the racetrack is and it could be so good because the cost actually is low. In local terms, it might be considered high by the people running it. Just make it a mega event for the people visiting.
Right, let's throw this open to the floor. Anybody got any questions they'd like to throw to Matthew? Yes, over in the far corner. We'll bring you in a microphone. If you just say who you are and then ask away.
Peter Bozar. Who am I? Some years ago, I actually did the international advertising for Marlboro, McLaren and Marlboro Ferrari under the Ayrton Senna and Michael Schumacher days. Quick question. Any updates on the medical condition of Schumacher? 2, what is your prognosis for the future of E-Prix? And can you say anything about the expected rule changes in 2026?
Okay. So no, I don't know anything about Michael. I know some people that probably do, and I don't ask them because it feels like we don't. I think Formula E is going to have a very good 2024. I kind of wear 2 or 3 different hats. I work on the commercial side of the sport, doing sponsorship for people and partnerships. As you know, I'm a broadcaster from time to time, and I'm also a massive fan. I'm a petrol head, so to speak, or a hybrid head. There you go.
Doesn't sound good.
I think next year is going to be great for Formula E because they've just put in place a new CEO. New CEOs tend to have, don't they, at least 18 to 24 months of support from the board. Really, they have to. I mean, they've got to give them support. And the previous CEO had to work pretty hard, I think, to put in place some of the building blocks for 2024. One of them being the race in Tokyo, March 30 next year. I think it's an incredible thing to have a motorsport event downtown Tokyo. So what I'm trying to say is the new CEO comes in without having spent any of his personal capital to get these things, and now he can exploit these things. The new cars are fast. I don't think it's ever going to be motorsport with fans in the same way we are, but there's a different demographic. So from just a different angle slightly on this, I think it's going to have a good 2024. But the other thing is, I had a conversation with some McLaren people the other day when we were talking to a brand about a partnership with McLaren, and the McLaren person said the reason we are active in Formula One, Formula E, IndyCar, Extreme E, and coming in the future at some point, probably the World Endurance Championship, no secret, is because we want to be the most popular, most well-known team in motorsport. So that overall, and I thought it was really clever, actually, and we get a different kind of audience from Formula E than we do for Formula One and so on. So that's that mixed together.
And the last point?
26 regulation changes. Well, interesting because it's going even more hybrid. So even fewer people in the grandstand are going to know that. So that's good, but that's the technological challenge. The bit that I think is actually the sustainability question we brought up earlier. I mentioned earlier that, Formula One's view, I understand, is it's when they're looking at new events, for example, of course, they need to pay a good rights fee. Of course, maybe not of course, it needs to be a very good fan experience. There's a queue of people that want a Grand Prix. Yes, the rights fee, of course, it's a business. Secondly, the fan experience, really, really important. Thirdly, sustainability is a really important point for Formula One these days, as it has to be for every business. And 2026 is really exciting because we're going from 10% e-fuel to 100%. And the e-fuel has to be non-hydrocarbons, non-fossil fuels, non-food sourced, and the critical part is drop-in. So the fuels that are being developed for 2026 by ExxonMobil and Shell and Petronas and the others will be able to be dropped directly into your whatever car it is you drive on the street. And there's 2 billion cars right now using internal combustion engines. So, and we're going to be burning hydrocarbons for 30 years, so at least, right?
So hopefully Formula One's going to mean the end of the electric car.
You heard it here first.
Yeah. Nigel Sharman, you had your hand up there.
Yeah, hello, Nigel Sharman. Is the dynamic between Russell and Hamilton good for the sport, good for Mercedes? They said at the weekend, well, the Wolf's the way the boys will play, and there seems to be a bit of that going on.
Yeah. I think I don't know. Is it good for the Mercedes? No, no, obviously not, because we know, again, history has shown us, if you want to win the title, the best thing is to have a guy who's clearly the best by a quarter of a second and somebody else who plays along with that and helps you score points and blah, blah, blah. And they don't have that at Mercedes. But then actually the good news for the second point is good for the sport. Yeah, because actually what we used to have was these situations with teams where they could do that. And nowadays, as I said earlier, we've got 20 drivers. I think they're all there on merit, more or less, but they're all there on merit. And therefore, none of them are going to be subservient to their teammate, really. And so it's a bit tough for Mercedes at the moment. But they need to have a guy to step in when 38-year-old Lewis Hamilton one day will decide to call it a day. Hopefully not too soon, but they need to have somebody. So yeah, short-term inconvenience.
Yes. There's your microphone.
Mike Bishop, race fan.
Good man.
I just wanted to talk about tyres, because they've always been important, but we seem to have got to a degree now where they deteriorate from corner to corner, and it seems to be the overriding factor above everything else. And have we gone too far, and is there a better manufacturer out there than Pirelli?
It's a good question, which I knew when I saw Mike stand up, I thought, no, this is going to be challenging, which is a good thing. That's a compliment of the highest order, Mike. So, exactly. So actually, first thing is, I actually don't think it's detrimental to the sport. because the challenge of managing the tyres over a race distance, sets of tyres, over a stint, race distance, has always been there, for greater and less degree. You know, there would, in the past, you would see drivers in Japanese, what was it called, Formula Nippon, now Super Formula, with these incredibly sticky one-lap tyres. They would drive incredibly slowly out of the pit lane like this. What's gone? Because they didn't want to put any energy into the tyre until the last few hundred metres, and then off they go, you know. And we see that kind of now, don't we, with the Pirelli softest tyre in qualifying. And it's part of the challenge. It's the reason why Piastri wasn't as quick as Norris over a race distance as Suzuka. So it's I think it's always been there. I understand the frustration that some of the drivers feel sometimes, where they feel, if I could just have gone flat out, I could have beaten the guy ahead of me. Probably the guy ahead of them feels the same way. I could have stayed ahead.
But this is better than a few years ago when they would fall off a cliff at the end of the race.
It's definitely getting better.
That was what dictated the result.
I think there's a couple of things. Also on the manufacturer part. I mean, I think Pirelli's done a lot for motorsport over the 74 years, by the way, and also in the last whatever. They're a great partner of Formula One. And so I'm very loath to say anything that's not absolutely positive about them. They're a great partner and they're very supportive. I think it's probably true to say that technologically Michelin and Bridgestone are probably at a different level, probably. And the reason that Michelin won't ever do single tyre formula is that Michelin's philosophy is, well, what's the point of going racing if we're not racing? You know, we don't want to just win races. But so if they came in, but they wouldn't. So my point there is they wouldn't come in unless it was Michelin versus Pirelli versus Bridgestone. And that would be interesting, but would it mean the racing's better? I don't think we'd have 6 different second place finishes and 9 different third.
Well, your carbon footprint's going to go up, isn't it?
There you go. Also that as well.
Yeah, I mean, sustainability-wise it goes. And, those days of carting thousands of tyres around, and it's going to increase the costs, and, Bridgestone's sort of boutique service to Ferrari didn't really do the sport that much good.
Well, by the way, it was a boutique service to Michael Schumacher.
Well, yeah.
Whoever happened to be driving the other car was driving with Michael Schumacher's tyres, which was,
Anybody else? Yes, down. Oh, who's going first? There we are.
John Saunders. So you used to be somewhat critical of Alex Albon. I think your view was that he hadn't, in the old days when he had the big seat, that he didn't really use the chances that he was given. But you seem to have changed, which presumably means you think he's changed. So what happened? Was he just overawed to begin with, or is it more complex than that?
So I think I was critical of. Critical is the right word. You're right. On Fox in those days, we had high expectations of Alex, as everybody did, and he delivered. And to be fair, when he was in Formula 2, I went to Christian Horner and Helmut Marko, and I said, "Why are you not talking to him?" And there is this, he's involved with the Red Bull family, and maybe I just said, "Did you watch what he did at Azerbaijan, or did you watch what he did here?" And they go, "Yeah, we're aware, we're aware." Because to me, the guy's super talented. They then did the typical thing. They put the guy in the AlphaTauri, or whatever it was called then, Minardi or something, and then I'm being slightly whatever. And then he does really well, so they put him into the top car and he gets thrashed, and then they kind of semi-destroy his career, right? Which is unfortunate. But on the other side of the coin, I wasn't convinced that Alex at that time was doing everything he could do to be the best. Now, he would argue, and I think that there are things that drivers need to do. So I'm a big fan of this guy called Rob Wilson, who's a 60-something, chain-smoking Kiwi, best driver coach I've ever come across. And one of the people we've mentioned earlier today still uses him regularly and goes there by helicopter, so you can probably work it out, which tells you a lot. And he's been with, when David Coulthard was at McLaren, I remember a conversation that my friend Peter Windsor had with David in the paddock at Suzuka, which was, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I think you could benefit for some time with Rob, because I've noticed a few little sharp edges on what you do. And David said, fine, let's go next week. I'll fly into Heathrow, get a helicopter, meet him there. Okay, which is the right answer, because if you're an F1 driver, you're looking for those. They're all, as we said earlier, they're all Champions League, they're all brilliant. You need every single detail. And if you're not doing every single detail, then, unless you're Max Verstappen or whatever. So I think I was critical of him then because I felt he should have been doing more of that. Maybe he should still be, by the way. Because, I mean, he crashed pretty badly in Melbourne. He's not perfect yet. But he's really doing a great job. So it's just really interesting. So I ought to go back to being critical of Alex Albon and saying, come on, you've got the potential. Let's deliver on it.
Right, yes, down at the front here, please.
Hi, Matt. nice talking to you again. My question is, do you think we can add more races in the calendar? Because you mentioned about market coverage, like India, like other countries. So, is it healthy to the sport to have more races? And also, if you can bring one track back into the calendar, which one will it be?
So first of all, Nelson is an old mate who I met in a bar.
Last time we met was at the airport in Nagore.
The first time we met was in Macau, in a bar in Macau in 2003 or 4, so 20 years ago. And because Nelson said hello, I was doing this because Nelson said hello to me. And it's a big thing. I was in a street in Japan a few weeks ago and somebody said, would you like to join us? They were drinking beer and I said, do you have cold beer? Yeah, and I joined them. It's people say, this is public information notice. Say hello to people, it really works, particularly post-COVID, because with them we can socialize more and you have mates like Nelson for 20 years. So thank you, Nelson, for being a friend for 20 years. I can't remember what your question was. Oh yeah, more races. So I think we're probably 24 is enough. I get the business side. I think, Bernie Ecclestone used to run Formula One before, and his concept was always keep it so there's a big queue of people outside the restaurant kind of deal. And as I said earlier, I think what Liberty Media have done with that business is taken it into a much, much better place. Certainly much better for the time also, by the way, because Bernie's time was Bernie's time, and this is different. I think we're getting to a point now where really, if we do more than this, it feels too many. It has knock-on effects, of course, on the people working in the sport already. When you see the media people having to, okay, I'm doing this race, but not that race, but then you see a lot of the mechanics. I see the same guys every weekend, guys and girls. Importantly, guys and girls. A lot more girls involved in the sport, ladies. But it's going to have some negative effects. So I think not really.
And what's the track you bring back?
Oh, I don't. Actually, I think there's one that would be great, which would be Kyalami, because I think to have a race in South Africa would be incredible. And I know that a lot of work has gone into trying to make that happen. And, it's never easy. It's not the Kyalami when Tim probably went there or claims to have gone there and seen Jackie Stewart win in 71 or whatever it was. But anyway, still, South Africa would be wouldn't it be amazing? And it's a good racetrack and whatever.
Got time for one last question. Okay, right.
Oliver Roost. Matthew, be interested more on the backside of the operations of Formula One, in particular the Stewards Committee. Be interested in a point of view of, you look at the stewards' effect on other sports, let's say most recently the Rugby World Cup, but you've got the football. It's changing the way the game in rugby is being played, the way football is being played. And it seems a lot of inconsistencies are coming through in Formula One now as well. You had last week, or 2 weekends ago in Singapore, the Max Verstappen fines twice. You've had inconsistencies with the same fines. People get 5 seconds. You get the driver penalties, blah, blah, blah. What's your view of how that moves forward without avoiding the impact it has negatively on the sport?
It's a good question, and it's a question that people are asking, as you know. I think the starting point of this is that motorsport is hugely, hugely complex endeavor. Off track, but on track, So whereas not to diminish what other sports have, but a ball is either on the line or over the line or whatever it is, and if you have a camera, you can more equally measure that. But if somebody pushed somebody or didn't push somebody, or all of these things, or if the car's slightly alongside, I don't even know the rules anymore. Is it the guy alongside going into the corner? It's very, very complicated, right? So I think the first thing is it's super complicated here, and then you try and govern it with a system here. So I don't think the system is the major problem, and the major problem is it's super complicated. But then the system is less than optimal, because what we have is a team of individuals who are all professional. I'm being very clear here with my words. They're all professionals, but they're not all paid to be there at certain times, which is an important point to understand. It doesn't change the way they work, I don't think. But so basically, you have there's a team of 4. One of them is a former driver, and the other 3 tend to work with the local racing authorities. There's normally one from the local authority. By the way, some of the people are super, I know a few of them, super lawyers, very good. They put together a good team. They do the best within the circumstances, absolutely. There is an issue, which is that the drivers tend to be now decades away from having driven Formula One cars, which is great, but also not great. Why are the more recent F1 drivers not coming in? It might be related to not being paid. You know, it's all very well getting flown to a destination and presumably business or first and a nice hotel, but you're not getting paid for your weekend, really. You know, the guys who raced in the 70s and 80s are just lucky to be alive, right? So that's okay for them, but the guys that were earning $1 million or $2 a year or 10 or whatever, why would they come? So I think we need to make it more attractive for people with more specifically relevant experience as a driver, the driver steward. I think it would be good to have a permanent panel, because if you've got all these variables over here and you multiply it by variables over here in the stewarding, you end up with that. Whereas if you had, you know, one of the things that's great about V8 supercars, IndyCar racing, probably others, you have probably BTCC in the UK, I imagine, the British Touring Car Championship. You just kind of know that's the person who's making the decisions, and you get to know over time. They'll let me get away with this, or they won't. You know. So I think it goes back to the 24 races question. Whoever asked that over here. You know, could you have somebody to do 24? Probably 1, 2, or 3, or you could have a panel. But I think they should be paid. They should be permanent, and give them a better chance of being more precise.
Right, okay, well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, so it's time to wrap it up. Matthew, as always, thank you for coming. It'll all be sorted out in Qatar. Will it be sorted out at the end of a sprint race? That's not going to be very satisfactory, is it?
It's not very. Tim's referring to the fact that Max is probably going to be world champion in the sprint race, because he only has to finish 6th or above, I think.
We get 3 points or something.
But we kind of knew that anyway, so that's small.
As always, nobody leaves the FCC without something. So there you are. Have another mug.
So gin martini. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Thanks.